Maybe you've heard the stories of dust storms that swallowed the sky, of men who walked away from everything, and women who turned scraps into supper. Or maybe you've just felt it, an ache in the air, like something heavy and unspoken still lingers from long ago. Welcome back to Sleepytown Radio, where the past speaks softly, the nights are unhurried, and the stories drift like a slow breeze through time. Tonight, we journey back to an era that reshaped America's soul. An era not just remembered in history books, but still whispered in the memories of families, folded into old letters, and echoed in the quiet resilience of generations. It was the 1930s. But before the dust, before the breadlines, before the silence of empty bank vaults, there was noise, there was laughter, there were bright lights, champagne, and music playing loud in city dance halls. It was the end of the roaring 20s, and America, it seemed, was dancing on air. The cities glittered with neon dreams. Radios sang in every living room, and stock tickers clacked their way into midnight as fortunes bloomed overnight. Everyone believed the good times were here to stay. But beneath all that sparkle, the floorboards were cracking. The storm didn't come all at once. It crept in, quietly at first, like the wind just before the sky turns. A shiver ran down the spine of the country, but most kept dancing, kept dreaming, kept believing. Until one Tuesday, when the music stopped. This is not just a story about economics or markets or numbers. It's a story about people. People who lost everything, but somehow kept going. People who planted gardens in vacant lots, who patched their shoes and their hopes in the same breath, who gathered around radios in church basements and potluck tables, holding on to what little joy they could find. It's a story about what it meant to endure and to find light even when the lights went out. So close your eyes if you'd like. Let the fire crackle. Let the past drift in. Because tonight we begin not with the fall, but with the world just before it. Before the crash, before the dust, before the dreams were tested. Let's go back to when America was still roaring, and no one yet knew that a long, quiet storm was coming. Before the storm, there was music. There was something electric in the air during the 1920s, a confidence, a rhythm, a belief that the world had been made new. America, untouched by the ruins of Europe's war, was riding high on prosperity. Factories hummed with promise. Jazz poured from open windows. Cities sparkled with new lights, and the hum of change seemed to echo through every street. People were dreaming bigger than ever before, and for a while it worked. The automobile rolled into driveways across the country, changing how families lived, worked, and traveled. Telephones rang in homes that just a few years earlier had relied on handwritten letters. Refrigerators replaced the icebox. Washing machines began to free up hours of labor. Electricity lit up kitchens. Radios brought voices from across the country into living rooms. And the stock market, well, it only seemed to go one direction, up. Everyone, it seemed, was in on it. From factory workers to farmers, teachers to tradesmen, people scraped together savings to invest. Stocks were no longer just for the wealthy. They had become the promise of a better tomorrow for the everyday man. And the belief, the deep, steady belief, was that America had entered a new age. One where the old rules didn't apply anymore, where boom times would last forever. But even then, there were signs, quiet ones. Factory shelves slowly began to fill as consumer spending lagged behind production. Farmers were already struggling with overproduction and dropping prices, their bounty rotting unsold. Banks were offering easy credit, too easy. People were borrowing to invest, gambling borrowed dollars on borrowed dreams. Still, the party went on, and no one wanted to leave early. Then came October 1929. At first, it was just a few worried glances, a whisper in the boardrooms, a sharp dip in stock prices. But soon, far too soon, the panic began to spread. On October 24th, known now as Black Thursday, 12.8 million shares were traded in a frenzy. Brokers shouted, phones rang without answers, and confidence, that delicate thread, began to snap. By Tuesday, October 29th, Black Tuesday, it was all unraveling. Billions of dollars vanished. Fortunes evaporated in hours. And for many, it wasn't just numbers on paper. It was their homes, their savings, their futures. Some men stood in silence, stunned. Others wept. A few jumped. And across the country, the music that had filled the 1920s began to fall quiet. But the crash wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. What followed wasn't just an economic downturn. It was a collapse, a sudden, brutal severing of everything people had counted on. By the time the shock had rippled through every town and farm, through every kitchen and factory floor, the roaring had stopped, and in its place came something else: silence. From here, our story deepens. We begin to see what life looked like when the roar faded, and all that remained was the quiet hunger of uncertainty. In the next chapter, we walk the streets where men lined up for bread, and dreams lay folded in the pockets of coats worn thin. We'll continue, together, softly, slowly, through the years that tested the soul of a nation. When the music faded and the stock tickers fell silent, a colder kind of sound settled into the streets of America. The quiet shuffle of shoes worn thin, the soft murmur of hungry voices in long, winding lines, and the hollow echo of empty stomachs beneath winter coats too light for the season. What had once been lives of modest security, of clocks punched, wages earned, and bills paid on time, had unraveled almost overnight. Men who just months earlier stood proud in office buildings and factory floors now stood on sidewalks, hats in hand, waiting for bread. There was no shame in it anymore, at least not the kind people tried to hide. It was too widespread, too visible. The Great Depression didn't just visit the poor. It swept through the middle class, knocked on the doors of small business owners, and pulled up chairs at kitchen tables where families had never known hunger before. In cities like New York, Chicago, and Detroit, breadlines stretched for blocks. Church basements, soup kitchens, and makeshift relief centers became lifelines. Volunteers ladled thin stew into tin bowls, poured weak coffee into chipped mugs. A piece of bread, maybe two. Enough to hold off the ache for a few more hours. But the hunger wasn't just in the belly. It lived deeper, in the soul. There's something fragile about a man who can no longer provide for his family. Something wounded, and the Depression wounded many. Some carried that weight in silence, tying up their pride like a loose necktie before heading out each day. Not to work, but to wait, to wander, to wonder what had happened to the world they thought they knew. You could see it in their eyes, men standing in line, staring down at the cracks in the pavement, not speaking, not looking up. Behind them, children fidgeted in threadbare coats. Mothers tried to keep their hands warm by wrapping them in dish towels, repurposed into makeshift mittens. And still, somehow, they endured. Neighbors shared when they could. A sack of flour here, a jar of jam there. Backyard gardens grew in alleyways and abandoned lots. Churches organized coat drives. Children passed down shoes with holes patched in cardboard. Every meal was a puzzle. How to stretch beans and potatoes for a family of 5. How to turn stale bread into supper. How to make soup from nothing but water, salt, and hope. Yet even in that sorrow, there was beauty, because people didn't stop caring. They didn't stop trying. The lines may have grown longer, but so did the arms that reached across them to help. They say broken dreams are sharp things, but sometimes when enough of them fall together, they become something else. A mosaic. A new picture, reshaped by necessity and grit. And across America, that mosaic took form. In the quiet resilience of a grandmother boiling dandelion greens for dinner. In the soft prayers whispered by a father before handing over his last nickel for bread. In the way a child still managed to laugh, even with an empty stomach. It wasn't easy, and for some, it was too much. But for many, the struggle gave them something they never expected, an understanding of what truly mattered, a deeper gratitude for warmth, for family, for the taste of something hot on a cold night, for each other. The Depression broke many things, but it also revealed many truths, and so they stood, in line, in silence, in shared sorrow, but also in quiet strength. Next, we'll follow one of those silent figures as he steps out of the line and onto a freight train headed west. A man among thousands who left behind everything, chasing the rumor of work or simply the hope of something different. We'll travel beside them as the rails hum beneath the weight of longing and the wind whispers across an uncertain road. Stay with us. The story continues. After the breadlines came the silence of absence. In many homes across America, there was an empty chair at the kitchen table, not because someone had passed away, but because someone had left to chase rumors of work in another town, another state, or just anywhere that wasn't here. They were fathers, husbands, sons, men who once stood strong beneath factory lights or beside their own workbenches, now reduced to wandering figures along dirt roads and railway tracks, their suit jackets turned into bedrolls, their faces weathered by worry more than by time. They were called Hobos. But behind the word was a story, quiet and heavy. During the Great Depression, hundreds of thousands of men took to the rails. With jobs vanished and mouths to feed, they felt the weight of failure pressing down. Some left out of desperation, others out of shame. Some hoped to send money back. Others left so there'd be one less mouth at home to feed. They hopped onto freight trains, silent in the night, slipping past guards, crouched between cars, their fingers curled around cold metal. They learned the rhythm of the tracks, the names of towns that might offer day labor, and the places with the kindest sheriffs or the warmest missions. Boxcars became bedrooms. Campfires became home. They formed loose communities in makeshift encampments outside city limits, known as hobo jungles. There, men would trade stories, share cans of beans, maybe hum an old tune from better days. They carved symbols into fence posts, codes that told others, "Kind woman lives here," or "Job here if you ask right." A secret language of survival. But life on the rails was not the romantic adventure some imagined. It was cold. It was dangerous. It was lonely. Many were injured trying to board moving trains. Others were killed, slipping between wheels, or struck by guards known as bulls, who beat trespassers without hesitation. Some towns posted signs, "No bums, keep moving." Others arrested men just for loitering. Being jobless became a crime in itself, and still they kept moving, because movement meant hope, and staying still meant facing the truth. There might be nothing left. Some men wrote letters home from train stops. Others couldn't bring themselves to write at all. They missed birthdays. They missed holidays. They missed watching their children grow, but they kept going. Walking tracks through cornfields, sleeping under bridges, washing in creeks. A man might go weeks without hearing his name spoken aloud, might forget the sound of his child's laugh, might forget what it felt like to sit down to a warm meal without guilt. And yet, among all that drifting, there was still a kind of dignity. A shared cigarette passed between strangers, a crust of bread saved for someone older, a harmonica tune floating up into the night, played not for applause, but to remember that somewhere far off, life still had music in it. These men didn't ask to be called heroes, but in their own quiet way, they were, because it takes a certain kind of courage to keep going when the world no longer makes room for you. To keep walking, to keep hoping, even when home feels like a memory fading in the rear of a train car. In the next part of our story, we'll step back into one of those homes left behind, into a quiet kitchen where a mother counts pennies, stitches socks, and turns a sack of potatoes into a week of dinners. Her strength wasn't in her wandering, but in her staying, and it held the family together, even when everything else was falling apart. Stay close as we continue our journey, slowly, gently, into the heart of the Great Depression. While fathers wandered the roads and rails, searching for work and a way forward, many mothers stayed behind, anchored to home, to children, to whatever thread of normalcy could be salvaged. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't have job titles, but they fought their own kind of war every single day. In the kitchen, she stood quietly, measuring flour with fingers, not scoops. She learned how to make a loaf of bread stretch for 2 meals, how to turn yesterday's boiled potatoes into tomorrow's soup. Nothing was wasted, not a crust of bread, not a bone, not even a whisper of bacon grease saved in a coffee can on the stove. She was an artist of survival, working with scraps and substitutes, her canvas a dinner plate, her tools a wooden spoon, and a prayer. There were no credit cards to lean on, no food delivery or microwaves, just a woman and her wits. And somehow, she made it work. She mended socks until the fabric thinned to threadbare. She turned flour sacks into dresses, patched knees with love, and taught her daughters how to sew buttons back on with hands that never stopped moving. Every penny was counted twice. Every decision weighed against the needs of the family. Butter or milk, coal or candles, soap or sugar. And when the money ran out, and it often did, she found other ways. Neighbors traded preserves for hand-sewn quilts, She might cut hair for someone up the street in exchange for a few fresh eggs. And if there was a garden behind the house, you could bet it was bursting with beans and greens and whatever would grow in tired soil. Even in towns where the soil cracked from drought or dust, she grew hope in window boxes, herbs in tin cans, tomatoes in buckets. She made things bloom because she had to, and through it all, she rarely complained. Her strength wasn't loud, it was quiet, enduring, steady. She knew how to smile with tired eyes, how to hold her children close so they wouldn't feel the hunger quite so sharp. She read bedtime stories with a warm voice, even when her mind was elsewhere, worrying over bills, over news from the bank, over whether the meat ration would last until Friday. Some nights, she skipped meals altogether, saying she wasn't hungry, just so her children could eat more. They believed her. In many ways, the Depression redefined womanhood. No longer just homemakers, mothers became lifelines, emotional anchors, economists, gardeners, healers. They carried more than their share and rarely set it down. Her hands told the story best. Calloused from scrubbing floors, rough from line-drying laundry in the cold, but gentle, always gentle. When brushing back her child's hair or pulling quilts up under small chins, whispering, "Good night, baby," even if the world outside didn't feel good at all. And still, somehow, she found moments of beauty. She sang while she worked, hung laundry like prayer flags in the wind, sewed curtains to soften a drafty window, lit a candle not for light, but for peace. That kind of love, resilient, quiet, unwavering, held families together when the world seemed to be coming apart. As we continue our journey through these years, we'll shift our gaze now to the bigger picture. Because outside those homes and kitchens, a far greater collapse was unfolding, one that would rattle the very foundation of American society. Banks were crumbling, money was vanishing, and trust was wearing thin. Let's move gently now into the trembling halls of finance and fear. There's a particular kind of silence that falls when the bank doors don't open in the morning. Not because it's Sunday, not because of a holiday, but because they're never opening again. In the early years of the Great Depression, that silence echoed across towns both large and small. It wasn't the sound of a robbery or a scandal. It was the quiet collapse of trust. People had believed in their banks. They deposited their savings, their wages, their futures, one paycheck at a time, into vaults that were supposed to be safe, reliable, untouchable, until one day they weren't. Rumors traveled fast in those years, faster than facts. A neighbor would mention hearing something about a weak bank in the next town over. A friend would whisper that someone's uncle couldn't withdraw his money, and that's all it took. Fear is contagious, and back then, fear had no brakes. The next morning it would start with a line. People gathered at sunrise outside their local banks, clutching passbooks, holding hands with their children, praying, quietly or aloud, that their money was still inside, that they weren't too late. But for many they were. Inside those marble buildings with ornate counters and polished floors, the ledgers told a different story. The money was gone, not stolen, not hidden, just vanished, erased in the chaos of stock market crashes, bad loans, and the overconfidence of the previous decade. Some banks tried to stall. They closed temporarily. They limited withdrawals. They promised reassurances no one could guarantee. Others simply shuttered, locked the doors, and disappeared overnight, taking thousands of families' life savings with them. By the time 1933 arrived, over 11,000 banks across the country had failed. That's nearly half of all American banks at the time. And with each failure, a little more of the country's trust crumbled. It wasn't just the money. It was the belief that hard work would be enough, that saving for a rainy day meant you'd be safe when the clouds came. But now the clouds had burst, and the umbrella was full of holes. In towns where the bank had once been a proud symbol of stability, it became a cautionary tale. People walked past those boarded-up buildings like walking past a graveyard, quietly, respectfully, with the heavy knowledge that something important had died there. Weddings were postponed, homes were lost, college dreams were folded into dresser drawers and never reopened. And still, somehow, people carried on. Some hid what little money they had left under floorboards, inside coffee cans, or sewn into the linings of coats. They no longer trusted vaults or ledgers or smiling bankers in suits. What they trusted now was touch. If they could hold it, they could believe in it. This collapse of faith wasn't just economic, it was emotional, spiritual, because when the institutions that held your dreams fail you, it's not just your finances that fall, it's your sense of security, your very belief in fairness, in order, in tomorrow. It was President Roosevelt who finally stepped forward with calm words and bold action. In one of his earliest fireside chats, he told the American people, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And with those words came the first glimmer of recovery. The creation of the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, meant that finally, money in banks would be protected. It wouldn't undo the losses, but it began to mend something far more fragile than ledgers. It began to restore trust, and while banks fell and trust trembled, nature too was beginning to turn against the people. In the open fields of America's heartland, the skies were no longer blue. The earth was cracking. The wind began to whisper of something worse, something brown and dry and coming fast. In our next chapter, we turn our eyes toward the horizon, where dust gathered like ghosts and the sky itself forgot how to rain. The sky didn't turn brown overnight. It happened slowly, subtly. A season without rain, a few weeks of wind. Then, one spring day, the horizon disappeared. They called it the Dust Bowl. But for those who lived through it, it was more than just a name. It was a long sigh from the earth itself, a slow collapse of soil, spirit, and sky. Back then, farmers had done what seemed right. They tilled deep. They planted wide. And when the wheat grew tall, golden, and proud, they harvested dreams by the bushel. But the land wasn't meant to be pushed so hard. And when the rain stopped, when the winds picked up, all that open, broken earth had nothing left to hold it in place. It began with a whisper, a dry rustle through the fields, a haze settling low on the road at dawn. Children came home with grit in their hair and sand in their shoes. Then the storms came. They didn't roar. They rumbled. Dark, rolling clouds that stretched from one end of the sky to the other. Not rain clouds, but walls of dirt. towering, endless, heavy as nightfall. People rushed to hang wet sheets over their windows, to seal cracks in doors with rags and newspaper. Mothers soaked towels and lined them along the floorboards. Fathers shut the chickens in early, nailed boards over broken panes, and prayed the glass would hold. And still the dust found a way in. It settled into soup pots. It coated the pages of family Bibles. It nested in pillowcases and between teeth. Babies coughed in their cribs. Old men wiped their eyes with trembling hands. Even silence had a sound, like sand shifting through wood, whispering across tin roofs, hissing low under door frames. On the worst days, noon looked like midnight. Farmers lost their way walking from the barn to the house. Cows stood in brown fields, their ribs showing through, their eyes red with grit. And people waited for wind that wouldn't stop, and for rain that never came. The land cracked open like a parched throat. Fences disappeared beneath dunes, and families, already hanging by a thread from the collapse of the banks, now saw their land turn to lifeless dust. Some stayed. They held on, teeth clenched, believing the clouds would break one day. They shoveled dirt out of their kitchens like snow. They replanted again and again, even when nothing sprouted. Faith is stubborn like that, but many couldn't stay. They packed what little they had, rolled up mattresses, flour sacks full of clothes, cracked dishes wrapped in towels, and left. They became wanderers on wheels, moving west toward California, where hope was rumored to grow in orange groves. But that's a story for the next part of our journey, still. For those who remained behind in Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Colorado, the Dust Bowl wasn't just a weather pattern. It was a way of life, a test of endurance, and a scar that wouldn't fade. Children grew up knowing how to tie a wet rag around their nose before going outside. Meals were planned around what could be grown in window boxes or traded with neighbors. And every time the sky turned even slightly gray, hearts clenched. But through it all, the human spirit persisted. Neighbors helped neighbors dig out doorsteps. Churches held potlucks in dark halls lit by lanterns, where the only thing richer than the food was the laughter. And parents still tucked their children in at night, brushing the dust off their foreheads with fingers that trembled from weariness, but never from defeat. It wasn't a romantic time, but it was a time of truth. And when the wind finally quieted, when green shoots once again poked through the earth, those who had stayed behind didn't cheer. They just nodded, quietly, and went back to work. As we leave the dust behind and follow the families who couldn't, we step into the next chapter of our American memory. A chapter lined with highway shoulders, dusty cars, and tired eyes staring west. Join us now as we travel toward California, chasing the same sun they once believed would save them. When the winds finally quieted and the dust began to settle, many families were left with nothing but silence and the decision no one ever wants to make. Do we stay and fight for soil that no longer grows? Or do we leave and hope something better waits beyond the horizon? For countless families across Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado, the answer came not from a place of choice, but from necessity. They packed what they could, mattresses tied to the roof, kitchen pots stacked like puzzle pieces in the back seat. Jars of preserves, a worn Bible, a photograph of a grandparent too old to travel. Everything else was left behind. Homes, graves, dreams, and they began to drive westward toward California. There were rumors, you see, whispers of orange groves heavy with fruit, of farm jobs and warm weather, of a second chance. To the desperate, that promise sounded like a prayer. The roads were long and hard. Route 66 became more than a highway. It became a lifeline. It stretched across the country like a ribbon of hope, frayed and fragile, but still holding. By day, the sun bore down without mercy. Children sweated in the back of old trucks, their faces pressed to the glass, watching the land pass by in slow, dusty blurs. Mothers told stories to distract them. Fathers watched the gas gauge, calculating silently how far they could go on the last few coins they had. At night, they pulled off to the side of the road, sleeping beneath stars under the open sky. Sometimes they found a vacant barn, sometimes just a quiet stretch of grass near a ditch. They lit small fires when they could, sometimes just for light, sometimes just for comfort. There was rarely enough food. A can of beans shared between 5, a heel of bread dipped in water. And yet, the fire always seemed to warm more than just their hands. Along the way, not everyone was kind. Some towns posted signs, no Okies. Others refused to sell gas or bread. They saw the migrants as a burden, a threat, a problem best kept moving. But among strangers, there were also small miracles. A farmer who gave a sack of apples without charging a dime. A widow who opened her barn for a night's sleep. A child who handed over their last cookie just because. And in those moments, the journey became something more than survival. It became shared humanity. By the time they reached California, the reality was often harsher than the hope. The orange groves were real, but so were the long lines of applicants. The jobs paid pennies. The camps were crowded, unsanitary, and filled with weary souls. Families lived in tents stitched from flour sacks and rags. Babies cried at night, not from fear, but from hunger. And yet, even there, they built lives. They held on to dignity however they could. A curtain strung between crates became a private space. A tin can became a toy. A lullaby sung softly under the stars became a shield against despair. The migration west didn't end in California. For many, it continued, searching, always searching, from field to field, job to job. But what they found along the way was not just hardship, it was resilience. Because you see, when people are forced to leave everything behind, they begin to realize what can't be taken. Love, hope, the quiet belief that tomorrow might still bring something better. As Roosevelt's voice began to crackle over radios across the country, promising a new deal and a path toward recovery, the hearts of many migrants listened, hesitantly, but hopefully. In the next part of our journey, we step into the moment the government finally stepped forward. When new programs were born, alphabet agencies were formed, and for the first time in years, the wind didn't just bring dust. It brought the first scent of change. The road west may have promised hope, But for many who arrived, that hope proved as dry as the dust they'd left behind, as families set up camps beside orange groves, as men walked from farm to farm looking for work, as women stood in breadlines with babies on their hips. The country, vast and proud, seemed unsure of what to do next. Then, in 1932, a voice cut through the static. It was calm, steady, and full of resolve. That voice belonged to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He didn't offer easy answers. He didn't pretend the road ahead would be smooth, but he spoke with something Americans hadn't heard in a while: confidence. And more than that, he offered action. When Roosevelt took office, he inherited a nation on its knees. Thousands of banks had failed. Millions were unemployed. Factories were dark. Farms were abandoned. And the streets were full of silence. But in his first 100 days, Roosevelt got to work. And slowly, a new phrase began to pass from neighbor to neighbor, whispered like a prayer. The New Deal. It wasn't one thing. It was many. A patchwork of programs, jobs, reforms, and ideas. It didn't fix everything, but it did give people something they hadn't felt in a long time: direction. There was the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. It put men back to work building roads, schools, and bridges. They dug ditches, painted murals, wrote plays. Work that didn't just feed the stomach, but fed the spirit too. The CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, sent young men into forests and parks. They built trails, fought fires, planted trees by the millions. For many of them, it was their first job, their first bed with clean sheets, their first hot meal in weeks. The AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, aimed to help farmers, not by growing more, but by helping them grow less. It was a strange idea, but a necessary one. Too much wheat, too much cotton. It had all driven prices into the dirt. By paying farmers to reduce crops, it helped the soil and the market recover. The FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, restored faith in the banks. No longer did people fear losing every penny overnight. If the bank failed, the government now promised protection. It was like putting a lock on a door that had once swung open in the wind. And perhaps most important of all, Roosevelt spoke to the people. Every week, he came into their homes, not in person, but through the radio. They called them fireside chats. In small living rooms, families gathered close, turning the dial just right to hear his words over the static. And there, in the glow of a single lamp, a mother might hush her child. A father might lean in. As the president spoke, plainly, honestly, without pretense, he told them what was happening, what was being done, and most importantly, that they were not forgotten. The New Deal wasn't perfect. Not every program succeeded. Some people thought the government was doing too much. Others, too little. But for the first time in years, the wheels began to turn again. Hope crept back in, not as a flood, but as a trickle. A boy saw his father come home with dirt on his hands and a smile on his face. A girl heard her mother laugh for the first time in months. Neighbors started planting gardens again, not out of desperation, but determination. The country was still bruised, still battered, but no longer beaten. And while the Dust Bowl raged on, and unemployment still haunted every town, there was a shift in the air. because now people were moving forward together. In our next chapter, we leave the halls of government and return to the neighborhoods, the porches, the potluck dinners and dirt roads, where Americans, though still poor in pocket, found ways to live richly in spirit. Let's step into the joy they created from the simplest things, when empty pockets still carried full hearts. The New Deal had brought jobs, stability, and a glimmer of hope. But make no mistake, most families were still poor. Paychecks, when they came, were small. Clothes were patched, shoes were worn thin, and yet, somehow, people learned to live fully in the spaces money could not fill. You see, when the luxuries disappear, the small things start to shine brighter. A child's laugh over a game made from sticks and bottle caps, the smell of cornbread in a cast-iron skillet, the sound of a fiddle drifting out an open window on a summer night. These became treasures, far more valuable than anything bought in a store. Sundays often meant a potluck at the local church or community hall. Everyone brought what they could, maybe a jar of home-canned peaches, a loaf of bread, or a single pie carefully sliced to serve a dozen. It didn't matter if it was much. It mattered that it was shared. Children ran between tables, their faces flushed with the joy of a sweet bite of cake, or the thrill of catching fireflies outside as dusk settled in. Evenings were often spent on porches, a circle of neighbors in mismatched chairs, talking quietly as the sky faded from gold to deep blue. The air was filled with the creak of a rocking chair, the clink of ice in a mason jar, and the soft hum of a radio playing a distant ball game or a slow tune. Sometimes the whole street seemed to pause, as if the world had decided to take a deep breath together. Entertainment didn't come from theaters or fancy clubs. It came from one another. People organized barn dances in cleared-out fields. Someone with a guitar or a harmonica would start a tune, and before long, there'd be laughter, stomping feet, and the rhythm of a dozen hands clapping along. If there wasn't music, there might be a storytelling night, where older folks spun yarns about their youth, sometimes true, sometimes wildly exaggerated. While the young ones listened wide-eyed, children became inventors of joy. They made kites from newspaper and string, raced soapbox cars built from scraps, and played endless games of tag in empty lots. A single ball, sometimes made from rags tied tight with twine, could keep a whole group busy until the sun dipped below the horizon. In many homes, the radio became the center of evening life. Families would gather close, the warm glow of the dial lighting their faces as voices from far away told stories, played music, or read the news. There was something magical about those moments. The way the world outside the front door felt both vast and close at the same time. Meals were humble, but they were rarely eaten in silence. A bowl of beans, a slice of bread, maybe a bit of homegrown greens. Simple fare, but made rich with conversation and laughter. People learned to stretch what they had, but they also learned to savor every bite, knowing the effort it took to put it on the table. Holidays were never lavish, but they were deeply felt. At Christmas, a homemade scarf or a carved wooden toy could bring tears to the eyes of the one receiving it. On birthdays, the cake might be small, but the singing was loud, and the hugs lasted a little longer. Looking back, it's hard to say if it was resilience or simply necessity that taught people how to make joy out of so little. But in those days, The measure of wealth wasn't in what you owned. It was in the closeness of your family, the strength of your friendships, and the peace of knowing you'd helped someone else get through another day. The Great Depression had emptied pockets, yes, but it had filled hearts with a kind of richness that couldn't be spent away. Neighbors looked out for one another. Strangers became friends. And entire communities learned that survival wasn't just about having enough. It was about having each other. And yet, for all the quiet joys of those evenings and gatherings, there was another kind of joy waiting just around the corner. A joy that came from energy, movement, and the rhythm of music itself. Because in the midst of hardship, America still found a way to dance. As America continued to find its footing through Roosevelt's New Deal, a quiet resilience began to bloom in backyards, basements, and street corners across the country. The kind that didn't always show up in speeches or policy, but whispered instead through laughter, music, and the low hum of a radio dial being turned just right. In those days, the rhythm of swing music slipped through the cracks of hardship. A warbled trumpet, a bouncing bass line, and a piano that played like a heartbeat. Families would gather around their radios, the tubes glowing warm, the volume low but clear. Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington. They weren't just entertainers. They were companions in the quiet. Their melodies drifted through kitchens where supper was thin, but spirits still lifted with every downbeat. Teenagers, especially, clung to the swing. In barns swept clean and church basements cleared of pews, dances would bloom like secret gardens. The jitterbug, the Lindy Hop, wild, joyful steps that looked like rebellion, but felt more like freedom. Boys in patched-up shirts and girls in hand-me-down skirts spun in circles, grinning, forgetting for a moment the weight that waited at home. The music didn't erase the pain, but it gave them room to breathe, to feel something like normal again. Outdoors, a different kind of dance took place, on wheels. Soapbox derby races became a beloved pastime, especially for boys with big imaginations and not much else. There was no need for a store-bought toy when a few pieces of scrap wood, a pair of wheels, and a bent nail could become a racing machine. Each homemade car was a masterpiece of determination. Old apple crates became sleek cockpits. Rusted lawnmower wheels transformed into racing tires. Boys would scavenge for parts behind hardware stores or barter with neighbors. "I'll rake your leaves if I can have that old axle." They'd paint the cars in whatever colors they could find, often mismatched, always full of personality. And then came race day. Neighborhoods would line up along makeshift tracks, sometimes just a sloping hill, sometimes a long driveway. Mothers brought lemonade in jars. Fathers, if they weren't working or looking for work, stood proudly on the sidelines. Cheers echoed through the air as the gravity-powered racers hurtled downhill, squeaky wheels rattling, drivers gripping their ropes like reins. Victory didn't always matter. It was the rush, the laughter, the shared joy of watching something move fast when life had felt so slow. And in the evenings, when the sun dipped low and families sat on porches with the radio humming in the background, stories were shared. News updates came between music sets, farm reports, presidential addresses, and sometimes a new serial program that kept everyone guessing. Little Orphan Annie, The Shadow, War of the Worlds. These weren't just shows. They were lifelines. For a half hour, a living room in Oklahoma could become the bridge of a spaceship, or the alleyways of Chicago chasing down a masked hero. Evenings felt sacred. The glow of a kerosene lamp, the scratchy voice of a radio announcer, the shared warmth of blankets and the smell of something simmering on the stove. There was hardship, yes, but also harmony, a different kind of wealth, woven not from dollars, but from rhythm, from imagination, and from togetherness. And as the music faded into static, and the last soapbox racer was pushed back into the garage, there was something unspoken between families. A sense that maybe, just maybe, joy didn't need to cost a thing. It simply needed a moment, a melody, a hill. The radio music faded. The laughter of soapbox races lingered like echoes from the afternoon, and for a moment, America caught its breath. But rest was never permanent. For every warm porch and backyard melody, there were still thousands without shelter, food, or certainty. The Great Depression had a way of demanding both stillness and movement, forcing people to keep going, even when their bodies could no longer keep up. And nowhere was that paradox more visible than in the dance marathons. They started small, a bit of harmless competition in a local hall, where young couples would see how long they could dance without stopping. But as desperation deepened and showmanship took over, they became something else entirely, a haunting mix of entertainment and endurance, where the prize wasn't fame or glory. It was food. It was shelter. It was survival. Some marathons promised $100 cash for the winning pair. Others offered a room to sleep in, or 3 hot meals a day. For some, that was more than they'd seen in months. And so, they danced. The rules were simple and brutal. Partners had to remain upright, moving at least slightly, for as many hours a day as they could. A band would play endlessly. If one partner collapsed, the other could try to hold them up. Rest was granted, but only in short, tightly timed intervals, perhaps 15 minutes every hour or two. Sleep came in snatches, leaning on each other in dark corners. Legs buckled, eyes rolled back, feet blistered. But still, they danced, and people came to watch. Spectators paid a few cents to stand behind ropes and gawk at the exhausted couples. Some cheered, some bet on who would drop next. Some just needed something, anything, to break the monotony of their own bleak days. It was theater and tragedy all in one, set to the rhythm of a waltz or a ragtime shuffle. There were moments of sweetness, too. Couples holding hands, smiling through fatigue. A girl resting her head on her partner's shoulder as they swayed in place. The announcer cracking a tired joke that made even the sorest muscles forget their ache for a second. But the longer it went on, the harder it was to find those smiles. Some marathons lasted days. Others stretched into weeks. The longest? Over 1,500 hours. That's more than 2 straight months. Organizers draped the venues in banners and streamers, trying to make the spectacle seem festive. But beneath the glitz, the floorboards carried the weight of dreams deferred. A young man who once worked in a shoe store now twirled endlessly for soup. A girl who dreamed of being a nurse leaned against the railing, her knees giving out, but her will holding fast. And yet, there was a strange kind of dignity in it all, not in the suffering, but in the persistence. They weren't just dancing for money. They were dancing for meaning, for motion, for proof that they hadn't given up, that even when the world had knocked them down, they could still move to the beat. If only barely. Some say the marathons were cruel. Others say they were necessary. But either way, they became part of the era's strange poetry, a symbol of a generation that refused to fall without trying, again and again, to rise on rhythm and resolve. Eventually, authorities in some cities began shutting them down, citing health concerns. Public opinion shifted, but by then, the image was already burned into memory. Tired feet shuffling across dusty floors, held up not by strength, but by sheer will. And when the final whistle blew and the last couple stood swaying in silence, it wasn't applause that filled the room. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that says, "You made it, you're still here." And in that silence, something softer stirred, something that would carry forward, because even when the music stopped, the spirit didn't. The dance halls had gone quiet, the marathons were over, and the silence that followed was not just one of exhaustion, it was one of emptiness. The kind that creeps in when even noise begins to feel expensive. But in that silence, something small, something made of ink and paper, began to shine. It arrived with a soft thud on the front porch every Sunday morning. The newspaper, folded, worn, sometimes damp with dew, and always carrying a little bit of hope tucked inside its pages. The comics, they were never much. Just a few colored panels surrounded by endless columns of grim headlines. But to the children of the Great Depression, those few pages were a portal, a ticket to another world, one with laughter, courage, and most importantly, happy endings. Among the most beloved of them all was a scrappy little girl with bright red curls and eyes wide with wonder. Little Orphan Annie. She wasn't glamorous or rich. She didn't wear a cape or fly through the sky. But she was brave. She was kind. And week after week she outwitted crooks, helped strangers, and somehow always found her way out of trouble, even without a family to guide her. To the children who read her stories, many of whom felt just as alone, just as uncertain, Annie was more than a character. She was a companion, a protector, a reminder that even the smallest among us could be strong when it mattered most. And she wasn't alone. Flash Gordon rocketed through space, battling aliens in his sleek silver suit. Dick Tracy, with his square jaw and yellow coat, brought justice to the shadows. Popeye, with a can of spinach and a crooked grin, punched poverty square in the nose. Each comic strip had its own rhythm, a setup, a twist, a laugh, a cliffhanger. And for 5 golden minutes, a child could forget the empty cupboards, the cold floorboards, the sound of a father's footsteps walking out the door. The paper cost only a few cents, but even that was more than many could spare. So the comics were shared, passed from child to child, neighbor to neighbor. Some families would cut them out and paste them on the wall. Others would copy them by hand, trying to capture the magic in pencil and scrap paper. They were loved like treasures, handled with the kind of care usually reserved for photographs or prayer books. And it wasn't just the children who read them. Mothers, sitting beside the stove, would glance at the panels and smile. Fathers, weary from job searches and long walks home, would pause at the paper to catch a glimpse of something lighter, something that didn't ask anything from them, because in a time when everyone felt a little like Annie, abandoned, uncertain, and struggling to find their place, these stories reminded them of what still remained: courage, loyalty, imagination. Even the government took notice. Some New Deal programs began including comic books in public libraries and reading centers, recognizing their power to keep literacy alive when formal schooling became less accessible. Ink on paper, that's all it was. But somehow it felt bigger than that, because when the world felt like it was unraveling, these characters stitched together something stronger: connection, a shared escape, a reason to look forward to Sunday morning. And for a child sitting cross-legged on a dusty wooden floor, eyes wide as Annie faced down another villain, there was something deeply comforting in knowing she would make it. She always did. And maybe, just maybe, they would too. While children clutched their Sunday comics with wide-eyed wonder, another story unfolded quietly, one that never made it into the papers. It was told not through words or ink, but through stitches in fabric, calloused hands, and the soft sound of shoes crossing kitchen floors before sunrise. It was the story of women, mothers, daughters, sisters, who held the family together when everything else seemed to be falling apart. The Depression didn't just steal jobs from men. It left entire households dangling over the edge. And when the weight of survival grew too heavy, it was often the women who stepped forward without fanfare to bear the load. They worked wherever they could. Some found jobs as secretaries, typists, or school teachers, positions that had long been considered respectable for women, though even those were scarce. Others cleaned homes, took in laundry, or worked long shifts in department stores, where the smell of perfume masked the desperation of trying to sell what few could afford. Many made their living in quieter ways, sewing for neighbors, mending socks for a nickel a pair, or baking bread to sell down the block. It wasn't always enough, but it was something. And in the world of the Great Depression, something could mean everything. For every dollar a man might have earned, a woman was often paid half or less. But that never stopped them. They stretched every penny, repurposed every scrap of fabric, and found ways to put dinner on the table, even when the cupboard seemed bare. They became masters of rationing. Leftovers were not leftovers. They were ingredients for tomorrow. A roast on Sunday became stew on Monday, sandwiches on Tuesday, and broth by week's end. If there was no meat, there was still cornbread, beans, and love stirred into every pot. And it wasn't just the food. They made clothes from feed sacks, colorful bags that once held grain, now washed and stitched into dresses, shirts, and curtains. With every needle pulled, there was a whisper of dignity. We may be poor, but we are not broken. But perhaps the greatest work these women did wasn't in the meals they cooked or the money they earned. It was in the spirit they kept alive. They comforted children with steady hands and soft lullabies. They listened to husbands who felt the ache of failure and reminded them of their worth. They lit candles on cold evenings, not just for light, but for warmth of soul. They became the backbone of the home, and often the quiet leaders of their communities. Some were criticized for working, told they were taking jobs from men, but they kept going, not for ambition or recognition, but because someone had to. Because survival doesn't care for social expectations. And sometimes, when the children were asleep and the house was still, they allowed themselves a quiet moment, a cup of tea, a few pages of a borrowed book, a letter to a sister written by candlelight. In those small acts, they reminded themselves, I am still here, I am still strong. Their sacrifices weren't always seen. Their names weren't etched into monuments. But the homes that stood through those years, the ones filled with music, laughter, even when there was little else, were often held up by the quiet, enduring strength of women who refused to let their families fall apart. And as this chapter folds into the next, where the children must grow too fast, where childhood is traded for work and responsibility, we carry with us the image of these women, aprons dusted in flour, wrists sore from scrubbing, eyes tired but never dull, and hearts that beat not just for survival, but for love. While mothers quietly held their households together, threading needles by lamplight and stretching soup pots over empty bellies, another story played out just beneath the surface. It was the story of children who never truly got to be children. In the long shadow of the Great Depression, youth was a luxury few could afford. The carefree days of playing marbles in the dust or skipping rope on the sidewalk gave way to a different rhythm, one defined by alarm clocks, factory whistles, and the clink of coins saved in tin cans. It started innocently at first, a child offering to run errands for neighbors or sell eggs door to door. But as jobs vanished and mouths remained, those small chores became full-time duties. Kids as young as 8 or 9 began working in textile mills, canneries, and coal yards. Their hands, meant for holding books or climbing trees, instead carried heavy pails or turned assembly line levers for hours on end. Some families sent their sons out alone, little boys really, hoping they'd find work in a neighboring town or with relatives, or perhaps on farms that still needed hands. With a sandwich wrapped in wax paper and a jacket too big for their frame, they boarded trains or hitched rides. Suddenly, men in a world that didn't ask if they were ready. For many, school became a distant memory. Attendance dropped sharply, not because learning no longer mattered, but because hunger did. A diploma couldn't buy bread, and an education didn't warm your feet in winter. So the classroom was replaced with the workbench, and lessons were learned in sweat, silence, and the tired nods of parents too proud to say thank you. Yet for all that was lost, something was gained too. These Depression-era children grew up with a kind of steel in their bones. They learned to fix things rather than throw them away. They understood the value of a dime and the dignity of a job, any job. They saw their mothers stretch a meal into a miracle, their fathers return home defeated but still holding on. And in those moments, they learned the quiet strength of resilience. They also became caretakers. Older siblings raised the younger ones. Sisters braided hair and packed lunches while their mother worked the morning shift. Brothers taught each other how to shine shoes or chop wood. They grew up not in years, but in responsibility. Yet even then, even amidst the strain, there were flickers of childhood that refused to die. A boy might sneak a comic book into his lunch pail. A girl might hum a tune from the radio while sweeping the floor. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the sky turned pink and the world felt still, They would lie back on a patch of dry grass and dream, not of riches or glory, but simply of something easier, a full meal, a warm room, a chance to be young again. And in those dreams lived the heartbeat of a generation, for this was a childhood without toys, without vacations, without the sound of ice cream trucks, but it was not without meaning. It carved out young men and women who would later go on to fight world wars, build new industries, raise strong families, and carry within them a memory of how hardship forged hope. They were the kids who never complained, who wore patched clothes with pride, who fell asleep with tired limbs but full hearts. And though they grew up too fast, they never forgot what it meant to have made it through. As we turn to the next chapter, where communities gather in church basements and open fields, sharing more than just food, we carry with us the quiet strength of those children. Not just what they endured, but what they became, and how in the hardest of times, even the smallest shoulders can carry the weight of the world. In the long valley of hardship, after the laughter of childhood had faded too soon, something else took root. It wasn't wealth, it wasn't work, it was community, wrapped in faith, held together by fellowship, and nourished by potlucks that fed far more than just the body. By the early 1930s, most towns across America had little left to offer in the way of riches. The storefronts were faded, the factories were silent, and many church donation boxes sat nearly empty. But what they still had, what never quite disappeared, was each other. When the weak had wrung every ounce of strength from their bones, Sundays offered something sacred, not just in Scripture, but in the gentle ritual of gathering. Women in faded dresses would clutch covered dishes wrapped in cloth. Men with weathered hands would wear their best shirts, often mended, sometimes mismatched, but always clean. And the children, even the ones who'd grown up too fast, they found small moments to be young again. Church basements and grassy lawns became sanctuaries of hope. There were long folding tables, laid out with dishes of every kind, whatever could be made from the week's scraps and stored preserves. Cornbread and bean stew, apple cobbler made from fruit that was almost too soft, potato casseroles that stretched one spud to feed 10 people. No one judged. No one compared. Every plate was shared. Every bite. Blessed. People bowed their heads, not because they were told to, but because they felt it. Because they knew that somehow, through dust storms, job losses, and hunger, there was still gratitude to be found. And in those quiet moments of prayer, the heaviness of the week lifted just a little. Hymns were sung slowly, voices cracking with age or emotion. And when the final note hung in the air, what followed was not silence, but warmth. Conversations over weak coffee, children laughing over borrowed marbles, a neighbor asking another if they needed anything. Wood, milk, company. Faith in the 1930s wasn't polished. It wasn't shiny. It was patched together like the dresses worn to service. Threadbare, yes, but strong. It was faith in one another, that if someone lost their home, a neighbor would offer a spare room. If a child had no coat, the congregation would find one. That no one would go forgotten, even in the most forgettable of times. And these gatherings weren't just about survival. They were about joy. Joy that refused to be stolen. Joy in cracked voices sharing stories. Joy in the clinking of spoons. joy in simply sitting side by side with others who understood, because they too were surviving day by day. Sometimes a fiddle would appear after supper. Someone would clear a space, and before long, feet would tap, hands would clap, and for one evening, the depression had no power there. These were not grand feasts or elegant affairs. They were simple, honest, built from what little folks had, but infused with what they never ran out of, heart. And as the sun dipped low, casting golden light through stained glass or bare windows, people lingered. Not because they had nowhere to go, but because it felt good to stay, to sit in the glow of others who kept showing up. The potlucks, the prayers, the laughter, they stitched people together in ways money never could. And as we shift now to Halloween tricks and homemade treats, where creativity met scarcity once again, we carry with us the spirit of these Sundays. A casserole dish passed hand to hand, a hymn hummed through cracked lips, a warm seat on a cold bench beside someone who said simply, "I'm glad you're here." After Sundays filled with song, shared meals, and quiet prayer, there came a different kind of gathering, not in churches or under the cross, but along dimly lit porches and dusty streets, under bed sheets turned into ghostly cloaks, and cardboard masks cut with safety scissors and care. It was Halloween, and even in the depths of the depression, with pockets empty and cupboards bare, the spirit of October 31st refused to die. If anything, it became something more, an act of defiance. A night when imagination triumphed over scarcity, and joy slipped through the cracks of hardship like moonlight through a boarded-up window. In small towns and city alleys alike, children plotted their disguises weeks in advance. There were no costume shops, no shiny plastic masks, just old curtains, flour sacks, and a touch of paint or coal smudged across a cheek. A girl might become a witch with a bent broomstick and her grandmother's shawl. A boy might fashion a skeleton out of black long johns and white chalk. The magic wasn't in the money, it was in the making. Homes that had stood still all year, suddenly transformed. Families who hadn't baked sweets in months would scrape together molasses, oats, and lard to make cookies wrapped in wax paper. Pumpkins, if they could be spared, were carved with knives worn thin from kitchen use, their flickering smiles glowing proudly from front steps. And if there were no pumpkins, well, a tin can and a candle would do just fine. Some parents got creative in the most unexpected ways. One might hang a slab of cold liver behind a curtain and have children reach in, pretending it was a monster's heart. Another might string cotton balls across a doorway for homemade spider webs. The living room sofa might become a haunted tunnel, and the attic a castle of frights. No one needed to spend a dime to feel the thrill. Kids traveled in clusters, pillowcases in hand, skipping down sidewalks cracked with time. There were no store-bought candies, but there were apples, popcorn balls, and small bags of roasted peanuts. A single stick of gum was cause for celebration, and every doorstep that opened was a little victory. Sometimes, the real trick was not the fright, but how a neighborhood pulled together to pretend that everything was fine. That for one night, no one was out of work, and no one was hungry. That ghosts and goblins were the only worries that mattered. And truthfully, it worked. Laughter rang out in places that hadn't heard it in weeks. children's feet echoed down roads usually lined with silence. And for just a few hours, parents watched from windows and porches, not with concern, but with the quiet relief of seeing their sons and daughters play again. Older kids helped the younger ones. They kept an eye out for little sisters who tripped on their capes, or younger brothers who got scared when someone jumped out from behind a bush. They weren't just trick-or-treaters. They were protectors, leaders, and little reminders that even when times were hard, care could still be passed down. By the end of the night, pillowcases held modest treasures, a few pieces of fudge, maybe a candy button or two stuck to the paper, a stale cookie that still tasted like heaven, and more than that, a sense of belonging, a moment of being seen, a rare night where kids felt like the world hadn't forgotten them. And as costumes were folded away and the last porch light blinked off, something lingered in the air, not fear, not sorrow, but something softer. A gentle reminder that even in struggle, joy could be found in the smallest things. A paper ghost, a painted gourd, a mother's warm smile at the door. As we step gently into the next memory, into the pages of books and the stories that carried people far from their pain, we bring with us the flicker of jack-o'-lantern light and the echo of small footsteps in the night. Because even in the Great Depression, Halloween was never canceled. It was just different, simpler, and in many ways more real than ever. After the laughter faded from Halloween night, and the last crumbs of homemade fudge were brushed from a child's fingers, a quieter form of escape remained. It didn't require costumes. It didn't need sugar. All it asked for was a page and a bit of light. In the long evenings of the Great Depression, when heat was scarce and radios sat quiet from a lack of batteries, many turned to stories. Some were read aloud, some whispered under quilts, some imagined in the quiet hush just before sleep. Books, old and worn, passed from hand to hand like treasure. A family might own just 1 or 2 volumes, their spines taped, pages dog-eared, the scent of time rising gently with every turn. But within those cracked covers lived whole other worlds, places untouched by dust, hunger, or fear. Children especially found refuge there, for the price of nothing but silence and imagination. A little girl could walk alongside Dorothy through the yellow-bricked land of Oz. A boy could grip a wooden sword and sail with Tom Sawyer down the Mississippi. Others waited eagerly for Sunday newspapers, not for headlines, but for comics. Little Orphan Annie gave them courage. Flash Gordon gave them space to dream. And sometimes, the stories came not from printed pages, but from the people around them. A grandfather sitting in a creaky rocker might recount tales of the old frontier. A mother might lull her child to sleep with folk stories she'd once heard in her own childhood. The best stories didn't come from bookstores. They were born around fires, whispered on front porches, passed down like heirlooms made of words. Libraries, when open, became sanctuaries, warmed by pot-belly stoves and lined with rows of hope. They welcomed everyone, no questions asked. Even if a child wore shoes with holes and hands too cold to hold a pen, they could still pick up a book and disappear for a little while. There was The Grapes of Wrath, which told of families just like theirs, struggling, searching, surviving. It wasn't fantasy, but it was affirmation, a reminder that their pain was shared and their endurance noble. For those who could read it, it gave language to what they lived through. For those too young to understand the politics, it gave them characters to believe in. There were mysteries, too. Dog-eared copies of Nancy Drew or the Hardy Boys, where danger could be solved by dinner time, and nothing bad ever truly lasted. These stories offered a comforting balance. Unlike real life, the endings were neat. Justice arrived on time, and no one ever went to bed hungry. Sometimes, a family would gather in the evening, one person reading aloud while the others listened with their eyes closed, picturing scenes in flickering candlelight. On cold nights, they'd huddle close, listening not just to the words, but to each other's breath, to the rise and fall of a familiar voice. It didn't matter how educated someone was. A story was for anyone who needed to be elsewhere, even if just for a moment, and in a time when life had taken so much, the written word gave something back. It gave escape, yes, but also dignity, power, comfort. It reminded folks that imagination could not be foreclosed, and that no depression, not even one this deep, could take away the soul's hunger to know, to feel, to hope. As we turn the final page on this chapter of quiet joy and slip into the next, let us carry with us the sound of turning pages, the rustle of a child pulling the covers tight, eager to dream of pirates, ponies, or planets not yet named, and the simple timeless truth that in the hardest of times, stories are not a luxury. They are a lifeline. After stories were read and lamps turned low, after children fell asleep dreaming of lands far from hunger and hardship, there remained a quieter truth, one that lingered just beneath the surface of the Depression years, in a time when so much had been lost: homes, jobs, savings, even hope. Something unexpected endured. Something even flourished. Health, not everywhere, not for everyone, but in many corners of the country, amid all the suffering. Americans, somehow, were living longer. It was one of those strange paradoxes that history sometimes leaves behind. A contradiction carved into the record like a whisper against the storm. Life expectancy rose, even as livelihoods collapsed. People were walking more, eating less processed food, and relying on what they could grow or trade. Homemade stews, vegetables from shared gardens, simple meals, often repetitive, but real. Gone were the flashy confections and sugary excesses of the 1920s. In their place were oatmeal, potatoes, cornmeal, beans, foods that had carried earlier generations and now returned to the table, humble but nourishing. The body, it seemed, knew how to survive, even when the spirit was weary. Fewer cars meant more footsteps. Men walked for work, women walked to markets, children walked to school if they could still attend. And in all that walking, in the rhythm of it, there was something healing, something steady. It kept hearts strong and lungs clear, even as the skies above turned brown and the banks below crumbled. In many homes, alcohol was scarce, not by choice necessarily, but by circumstance. With prohibition still fading and every penny counted, drinking was often a luxury no one could afford. And in its absence, bodies rested easier. Liver disease declined. Accidents slowed. Doctors, too, became part of this new simplicity. House calls, once rare for working families, became the norm again in rural areas. Payment might come in the form of eggs, or wood, or a warm loaf of bread, but care was still given. And it mattered. Mental health was a different story, quieter and less understood. There were no names for the deep sadness that settled over some, or the fears that clung to others like smoke. But even then, communities leaned on one another. Churches stayed open. Neighbors stopped to check in. A shared potluck, a quiet prayer, a laugh over something small. These became medicine too. And perhaps more than anything, people began to slow down, not because they wanted to, not because it was fashionable, but because they had to. There were no long vacations, no shopping trips, no rush to get anywhere. The world narrowed to the front porch, the corner store, the walk to Sunday service. Time, once measured in stock prices and train whistles, began to stretch and settle. A boy might spend the whole afternoon whittling a piece of wood. A girl might sit on the stoop and braid grass. Parents lingered over coffee, even if it was weak and watered down. And in that slowness, life returned. The kind of life that is lived with presence. People watched the seasons more closely. They noticed the color of the sky, the shift in the wind, the crunch of frost on early morning ground. They marked time not by bank statements, but by harvests, by birthdays, by the growing hems of children's pants. In this strange and difficult decade, Americans lost so much. But they found something too. They found rhythm, resilience, and in the simplest of routines, a kind of health that no economy could measure. It wasn't perfect. Many still suffered. Many did not make it. But for those who did, they carried forward something quiet and strong. A memory of a time when survival was both brutal and beautiful. As we approach the final chapter of this long night, let us remember that even in the darkest winters, there are fires that burn. Fires fueled not by wood or coal, but by spirit. And for a generation shaped by scarcity, that spirit became something sacred. And now, as the fire softens and the world around us grows quiet once more, we come to the final chapter of this long, difficult decade. The Great Depression was never just a page in a textbook. It was a storm, a slow, grinding storm that touched every porch, every kitchen, every pair of hands. It took jobs, homes, savings, and sometimes even hope. But it could not take everything, because somehow, despite the dust, despite the hunger, despite the silence left behind by fathers who vanished on freight trains, people held on. They held on to love. They held on to each other. And in the very act of enduring, they created something extraordinary. This was not a generation built on luxury or ease. It was built on mended clothes and cold suppers, on shared loaves of bread and worn-down shoes passed from one child to the next. It was a time when laughter still echoed down empty alleys, when a game of marbles or a ribbon in a girl's hair could brighten a whole afternoon. It was faith over fear, community over chaos, and dignity, even in despair. Families lit candles when the lights went out, not just in their homes, but in their hearts. They sang. They prayed. They wrote letters to sons and daughters far away. They took in neighbors when they could, even if it meant splitting a meal in 4 instead of 3. And when government programs arrived, when New Deal jobs began to pave roads, paint murals, build schools, it wasn't just about the work. It was about feeling useful again, needed again, human again. The Great Depression wasn't simply survived. It was lived through with full hearts, tired hands, and quiet courage. And that is perhaps the most enduring lesson of those years, that in the darkest of times, America did not break. It bent, it stretched, it suffered, but it did not shatter. Because behind every shuttered bank and every dusty field, there was a grandmother teaching her grandson how to make cornbread without flour. There was a boy carving toys from driftwood. There was a girl learning to sew, not from a teacher, but from her mother's trembling hands. And all of them made it through. Some say that generation was the greatest, not because they had more, but because they learned to live with less and love with more. And tonight, as the embers glow and the stories settle, we remember them, not as statistics or sepia-toned memories, but as real people, just like us. People who whispered bedtime stories with empty bellies, who danced in living rooms to scratchy radios, who lit fires not only for warmth, but for each other. And maybe that's the gift they left us. Not just tales of survival, but reminders that kindness costs nothing, that strength is often quiet, and that in the end, it's not the riches we carry forward, but the love we gave when we had nothing else. So as you drift off now, under your own warm blanket, perhaps with a full belly and a peaceful home, take a moment to breathe in that gratitude, to feel the steady pulse of a people who came before you, who walked through shadows, so you could rest in light. Close your eyes, dear listener. The world has been heavy, but tonight it's just you and the quiet hum of memory. And somewhere in the hush between heartbeats, a whisper still lingers from that distant decade. We were poor, but we were together, and somehow that was enough. So rest easy now. Let your thoughts soften. Let the warmth of these old stories wrap around you like a quilt stitched with memory. Sleep deeply, sleep gently, and know that you are part of something long and strong and beautiful. This has been Sleepytown Radio. Thank you for spending the night with us. Until next time, good night and sweet dreams.